Good evening. An overcrowded freight shed with no food, clothing or hot drinks and nowhere to sleep other than a concrete floor. That's what hundreds of asylum seekers who made it across the Channel faced on arrival to the UK last summer, according to a report released today. Her Majesty's Inspectorate of Prisons looked at how people who got into Britain, hidden in vehicles or freight trains, were dealt with on their arrival. It found that some were held in a space which was not adapted for use as a holding facility and that staff had not received proper training to deal with the situation. And figures show that the number of asylum seekers detained at Dover Seaport increased significantly from over 2,000 in 2014 to nearly 5,000 by last year. And as we mentioned, many detainees were held overnight on the concrete floor of a shed with no clean or dry clothes and offered nothing in the way of hot food or drinks. Well, for more on this, I'm now joined by Will Baker. He's from the Dover Independent Monitoring Board. It's responsible for investigating the treatment of people held in detention. Will, I've given an outline of some of the conditions facing the people when they arrived here in the UK. What else do you understand they had to go through, they had to endure?
Well, this report that was published today was produced by the Inspector of Prisons. So I should firstly add that it's not a report by the organisation that I represent. But some of the conditions that it referred to really came about as a result of the huge, overwhelming numbers of detainees who were coming through as potential asylum seekers. And, for example, many of the people arriving in Dover were very cold, were perhaps wet through because there was some very heavy rain, were quite dehydrated, hadn't been able to eat properly, and many of the facilities at Dover and Folkestone simply couldn't cope because they weren't designed to hold that number of people.
What sort of numbers were we talking about at that stage in the major influx?
Well, there were about 3,500 people over the summer months who were held in the holding facilities in Dover and Folkestone. And certainly as a temporary measure, this freight shed in Longport was used. And when you read the Inspectorate's report, you see that they actually focus on three main locations. They talk about the seaport in Dover, they talk about a holding room in Folkestone, and also about this freight shed.
But just how long were they being held in these conditions? It was about 12 hours, wasn't it? It wasn't weeks or days, though.
Yeah, no, most people weren't held there for longer than 12 hours, but some of them were. And what the Inspectorate highlighted was that the conditions in which they were held were really not suitable. So no proper bedding, for example, people having to sleep on a concrete floor, not having access to the right facilities.
But as you said at the start, this was an overwhelming number. In defence of the authorities, they simply couldn't cope at the time. Are you happy now that the problem has been addressed? And do you expect to see improvements when you start your inspections soon?
Well, I'm not yet in a position to comment, neither are my colleagues, about what we've observed because our monitoring is yet to begin. It's about to begin shortly. But if we look at what the Inspectorate has said, the Inspectorate has highlighted the fact that this freight shed in Longport is no longer going to be used. And the Immigration Minister, James Brokenshire, has confirmed that that's not going to be used anymore. The other locations that were talked about, the seaport holding room, the holding room in Folkestone, they're actually due, well, certainly the Dover location is due for a refurbishment. And many of the recommendations that were made, in fact, I think most of the recommendations that were made by the Inspectorate have been accepted by the Home Office. So there should be some changes and some improvements.
And you'll be going on a voluntary basis to check these places?
Yes. Well, another positive development is that one thing that the Inspectorate mentioned in their report was that there was no independent monitoring board of these facilities. Now, every prison, immigration removal centre and most short-term holding facilities in the UK have what's called an independent monitoring board, who are basically groups of community representatives, volunteers, who will go in, have pretty unrestricted access and go in on a very, very frequent basis, several times a week, and look at everything that goes on, the food, the facilities, the interactions, the ways in which people are treated. And independent monitors are able to feed that back to the Home Office managers, to the contractors managers, and report annually to the Secretary of State and the public about what they find. That's something that's just about to start in Dover. My colleagues and I on the Independent Monitoring Board have just been asked to start monitoring those facilities.
All right, so just in a word, you are absolutely confirming now that people won't have to go through those terrible conditions that they endured when they first arrived. You're optimistic that won't happen again, just finally?
We will certainly be monitoring, and we will certainly comment if we do see any of that sort of thing happening.
OK, Will, thank you very much indeed for joining us.
Okay, thanks very much.